So I've started the recording and we are here for our very first ever, at least for me, Mark's done this before, Flow Ask Me Only Thing session. So thank you all for joining us. I see we have a bunch of people in the chat. Bring your questions. And we're going to kick things off with a little intro to both of ourselves and a little bit about how we got into Flow in the first place. So Mark, I'm going to let you kick it off.
Cool. Yeah, sure. So I've surprised, despite how much I actually do in and around the community on Flow, I've only probably been using it for a little over 2 years or so. It was the Winter 21 release that I started really diving into Flow, which was right when, shortly after Record Triggered Flows came out. This was the release where the ability to use prior save values in Record Triggered Flows came about, and I really started diving into Flow around that time. But I had interest in it for a good few years before. So previously, compared to what I do now, I work as a Salesforce consultant now. In my previous role as a non-profit admin, and once a year we would hold these annual conferences that I would go to see basically the product that we were using. There would be a big conference around that, and in one of the sessions, somebody showed off something on a screen which I thought was really, really interesting. And it was one of those things where, when you see something, you go, that's what I wanted my Salesforce org. Didn't have a clue what it was at the time, didn't know anything about it. So I approached the speaker afterwards and goes, oh, can you tell me what that is? And it's a Flow. So from that point, I was kind of like going, I want to get into Flow at that point. It took a couple of years to do that. But since then, I have been fully on board with the Flow train. I'm, in fact, wearing my Flownatic t-shirt, which you might be able to see slightly over here. I speak on Flow very regularly within the community. In fact, this is trying to think of the number of presentations. I think it's something like 12 conference sessions or something this year, and only two of them this year have not been about Flow. So out of all of the sessions I've been to this year and spoken at, they've all pretty much been Flow, and I regularly do support to the community in Flow, whether it's providing sessions to teach people Flow or just talking about it because I'm an absolute Flow geek. And I guess is that enough kind of background context? Do you think, Vicki, or shall we?
Yeah, that's good.
I could go on forever.
I see a couple of questions coming in, so I'll introduce myself and then we can hit the questions. We've got plenty of stories to tell if people don't have questions, so we'll be able to fill up the time, no problem. So yeah, that's awesome intro there, Mark. And I'm a little bit of a different story, I'd say. I came in through the teaching route. So I was an English teacher in a past life and love giving back, love sharing knowledge. And I started by teaching the admin side. I teach Marketing Cloud. I teach Pardot as well. And most recently, I've started to teach one of the Trailhead Academy Flow courses. So I came through the windy train consultant, now down the architect path, but that teaching has always been a part of it. I love to give back. I feel like I really know something when I can teach it back to somebody. And that's what really drives me at the end of the day. So Trailhead Academy has a Flow class, but not strictly Flow, but quite a few days of Flow in it, called DEX 403. And that's one of the ones that I recently started to teach and absolutely love it. And I've been doing low code, getting into Flow. I've done Flow for quite a few of my clients as well. And then I also do the pro code side. So I came through the Rad Women Codes course and learned how to write Apex, and especially love that intersection in between the two. So when you can use Flow for some things and then get Apex when Flow doesn't cut it. So yeah, that's where I came from. And I see we've got a couple of questions in already. So I'm going to start bringing them in. Many says, is Flow killing slowly the developer's role, and should we be worried? Yeah, if you want me to, I can take that one, Mark.
I think it's one of those ones will probably be good for us to maybe both answer, to be honest. If that's
yeah.
All right, yeah. I can share briefly my thoughts, because one of the things that you see, if you keep your ear to the ground on both sides of the spectrum, is that developers regularly have these conversations around, is the kind of the need for higher skill levels in development going to kill off the admin role? David Liu has posted content around, is the admin role disappearing because of the enhanced needs around admins to learn essentially developer skills traditionally. Whereas if you see on the declarative side, we often hear these conversations around, well, is because of the growth in flow, is that killing the developer role? So what you see is both conversations happen at the same time. My opinion is that no, flow isn't killing the developer role. I do think, though, it is kind of blending the admin role a bit more with the developer role. Now, there is obviously a lot of times where you need someone with a developer skill set to work on like coded level stuff. Like, I'm not a coder necessarily myself. I can do bits and pieces here and there, but I'm not a coder myself. So I have to at times go to people who do write code and go, can you do this? Because this is something that we need a bit of code with rather than doing flow. But I think it's more that the roles are getting more and more kind of like merged together as the years go by. But I don't think ultimately that either role will disappear, despite what you might hear. I don't know what you think about that, Vicki.
Yeah, I was just actually reading a 10K article yesterday about this. They did the whole survey and everything like that. And we're posting that the developer role is actually still one of the most highly in demand roles. So they've seen a dip in demand for the admin role for the beginner because it is moving more towards a demand for consultants. At least that's what they found in their reporting. So it might be a little bit different out there. It always depends on where you're getting your information from. But just even basing it off of that, I think that all of the roles are evolving. And from what I've seen on the developer side is that developers are trying to learn low code. So that's actually the course that I teach is geared towards developers trying to learn low code so that you can use both, so that you can open it up for admins to take control over the automation that's happening. And developers, I've seen a lot more push towards learning Lightning Web Components, for example. So it might be that there's a little bit of a shift there. It's not as much Apex necessarily, pure Apex, just for handling all of those triggers and the business logic, but it is, since Flow can do quite a bit of that, but there are still use cases where a screen flow is not going to cut it. So it's bringing in those Lightning Web Components, those more advanced UI features as well. So I don't see the developer role going anywhere, and it looks like the research is there to back it up. Yeah, and next question here, and feel free to ask follow-up questions based on this as well. So I know that we don't have mics enabled for everybody, but feel free to just kind of keep the chats coming in.
Many has asked if we can potentially share that survey, if we can find the link.
Yeah, I'll try to find the link. I think I saw it on LinkedIn the other day. It was just yesterday.
Was that the thing that was that the thing that Salesforce Ben shared with the roles and which ones was in more demand?
Could have been. Not quite sure there, but we can look for that on the side and get that back over, or otherwise we'll follow up with it as well. So next question from Andy: how do you feel about accessibility and how Flow works on mobile devices? We use Flow within web communities for residents to complete. Yeah, that is a great question. So I actually haven't worked with screen flows as much on mobile devices to see how accessibility is with those. I know historically Salesforce is pretty good about building accessibility into all of their products. If it's not there straight away, putting it on the roadmap pretty quickly. So I had done some research with one of the accessibility nonprofits in the UK, Thomas Pocklington Trust. And we had gone through Salesforce for the administrator course and tried to figure out everything that was accessible and wasn't accessible as far as administrator roles went. And the only thing that we really found at the time, so this was a couple of years back, was that the page layouts were just one big block and you couldn't drag and drop the fields into the right places. And that was replaced by dynamic forms. So that was the solution there. So I don't know, Mark, do you have anything about accessibility, particularly in the Flow space?
Yeah, well, so floors, particularly screen floors, are designed to be natively responsive to the device on mobile. So if you're using the floor in a community, if you're, for example, if you built it as like a 2-column screen and your screen would only work with a 1 column, it will natively push your second column underneath your first column in there. So in terms of accessibility, Salesforce do I feel a decent job in terms of particularly that side. There is work going on to kind of try and make it a lot more user friendly in terms of, you might have seen that recently with things like section headers coming in, and there is some improvements that'll be happening probably over the next few years in terms of that particular side. So I think accessibility wise, I think it's, in a sense, I think it's okay at the moment, but I think like with other things, it could be improved, and I think the Flow team are working on that. Like with the dynamic forms in Flow, that's getting a lot of work over the next few years. So I think it's okay accessibility wise, but it is
Yeah,
being worked on.
I just put this into the chat as well. So while you were talking there, Mark, I found an article around Flow runtime accessibility. So I think if we don't have the answers directly, this will definitely looks like it has everything you need. So I've just stuck that into the chat. And if you're watching a recording, it is the article called Flow Runtime Accessibility Considerations, and a quick search on the help documentation will find it. Oh, and I forgot to flash this screen up before. So before we go on to any other questions, we had done our introductions, but we forgot to go over the most important ground rule here. It's one that I use every time that I teach a course. So the most important rule of all, there's no such thing as a silly question. We are here from all different levels. So it might be that you have a more advanced question, a lower level question, a more beginner question. There's no such thing as stupid questions, especially when you're learning something new. So if Albert Einstein says it, then that means it's got to have some truth behind it. Cool. So yes. Next one, for new Salesforce admin career starters, which sources would you advise to start deep learning about flows without getting lost among them? So Mark, I'll let you kick that one off. I know.
Yeah, sure. So for new admin stars, which source would you advise to start deep learning about flows? Yeah. So what I would say is one of the best experiences that you can ever do with Flow, and it will sound like a little cop out of an answer to this, but this is just what I feel. I feel the best teacher when it comes to learning Flow is experience. So my recommendation is always get registered up for a dev org, whether it's a Trailhead Playground, whether you just get a dev org that you can get through developers.salesforce.com and start trying out and working through Flow. So that's one of the things I would say is on the top one there. As well, there's some really good badges on Trailhead that you can start with to learn with that. I'm going to share a link into the chat, but I do actually have a trail mix of what I feel are probably the top 5 best Flow badges on Trailhead right now. And a lot of these are beginner friendly. We've got ones in there like the Flow Basics, badge on record triggered flows. So those are good sources as well to go with. So I'll share that link into the chat as well. There's some good courses on Udemy on Flow as well. Particularly Andy Uken's course is a very good one for I would say for beginners. I can pull up the link and share that into the chat as well. But those are the kind of things I'd be looking for as well. Automate This as well on YouTube is being really, really good, and that's a monthly video podcast that Jen Lee runs with various guests, and that is a really good set of video content. And Sylvia also mentioned the comment as well about finding mentors. So it's not as big of a thing in the community right now, unless you do it ad hoc. It's not anything kind of like official to go, hey, look, I'm looking for a mentor to teach me on Flow as such. But finding a mentor is also a really good thing on that. And then there's people in the community who are regularly putting out content. in the community, such as myself, and I'm looking at how we do, how I can do more kind of sets of sessions, particularly to help people learn flow. So there's a lot. There's a lot as a
Yeah, and I can add some in as well. So I'm just going to flash this above the screen. But I think that this is a hidden resource that not everybody comes to very often. And there's a lot of great content on Trailhead under the videos. So if you come into the Learn tab and over to Trailhead Live, there's some great sessions around automation, flow. I know that there are some beginner Salesforce fundamental sessions as well. It looks like this one is in Spanish, but I know that we have them in English as well. But week 6, I believe, is all around the automation. So coming in here, these are all of our certified instructors who are sharing content there as well. And then YouTube blog posts. There's a lot of really great stuff out there. So sometimes it's finding the use case. Think of like little things that you could automate in your real life, because not all of us are in a job role when we're getting started. I know I have a dev org myself, and I follow my learning journey in it. So I have put in all of my learning assignments and everything like that. And for the things that I find myself doing on a regular basis, I make myself automations. So when you're sitting there saying, oh, I have to re-click over and over again here, go ahead and automate it. And I've used code for that. I have used flow for that. I've used screen flows to make it easier to create multiple records at the same time, and nice little wizards there. So it can even be, I've heard of people making dev orgs to manage medicine when they get a prescription or kids appointments or whatever it is in your day-to-day life that you might be able to get into a dev org to have that use case. Because sometimes, yeah, experience is great, but it's finding the use cases, the business case behind that experience and being able to find it. Sometimes it's making your own experiences. Well, so I'm going to come back into the Q&A. Generally speaking, when would you advise using code over flows? There's still things that flows can't do. So there's less and less limitations out there. We had Diana Jaffe on just yesterday, and I think we're okay with sharing it because she shared it with us yesterday. But the 2000 iteration limit on flows is going to be a thing of the past next year. So that's on the roadmap. That was one of the big things. So whenever we were doing bulk processes, but there are still things like I know in one of the courses I teach, we have an example of multiple records and record triggered flows, checking requirements, and then making an update based off of that. But what happens if you have a bulk import? What happens if you have multiple records coming in at the same time? Well, if you have a check going on and then a verification record being created or updated, then it could risk to do that same verification record as many times as there are records in that grouping going into the flow. So I don't know that that's particularly clear without like a slide to back it up or an example there. But if you're it's thinking through the use cases and not only, okay, record triggered flow, I'm going to have this business logic happening off the back of this requirement that's happening in Salesforce, or create a Reddit edit on a field or whatever it is. But then what happens if I have bulk records coming in? Is it going to handle that or is it not going to handle that? And that's still a use case for coding. So there are those use cases. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Flow handles the large data volumes when that limitation is lifted as well, because sometimes we see that some of the declarative products don't perform quite as quickly. So that might still be a consideration, but since it's a roadmap item, we don't quite know yet.
Yeah, I guess on that front, I'll ask a sub question, because my head is going straight to loops, which is because I off the top of my head don't know what the limit is around loops in Apex. Do you know what that is, Vicki, or?
You just have your DML limits. So all the DML limits are creates, edits, things like that. So you want to bulkify your code, which means that you would have lists that are managing all of that, and you just do one update on the entire list. kind of like in Flow when you have the collection. So you have that one update on the entire collection, but there aren't any limits there. So that's where loops were a really good way of hitting the 2000 limit while we still have it. That's a reason to go towards code for the moment, but hopefully that'll be a thing of the past soon.
Yeah, hopefully. I was just thinking about that because I know within Flow, you've got the 100 kind of loop around limit in terms of we can only go around the loop 100 times. If you go over that, your flow will then start to fail. So that's one example I can think of where code would possibly be a better solution, because if you go, okay, I need to loop around more than 100 records in a loop example, you might want to work with code to do a replacement for that kind of task. But I don't know enough about that on the Apex side to know how you would do that in code. I just know in Flow you can't go around a loop more than 100 times.
Yeah, and you can in code, so that's a really good example. And I would say that if you didn't catch Mira's session before, when we're on the recordings, she did a really great session on invocable Apex. So you can make your code basically work almost like a subflow. So you've got a subflow that would be doing all of the business logic for you underneath, and then feeding information, feeding variables back into the flow. Well, you can do the same thing with Apex. So if you hit any of those limits, if you need to have code that's running through all of those different loops for you and handling all of that, it can do whatever it needs to do, and then it can feed variables back into your flow as well. So it might be a really good use case for invocable Apex, because you can't turn Apex on and off. You can't edit it in production. And I've seen that be a problem for clients, especially when you don't have technical people on the team, is that, okay, we want to do an import, but I've got to turn the Apex code off, disable it in Sandbox, and then deploy that to production. And that's the way to turn it off, to turn off an Apex trigger, where if you make it as invocable in a flow, you can turn that flow off, you can deactivate it in production and not have to worry about that. We might have gone a little off topic there, but hopefully that did more than answer your question.
I think that still kind of covers the question. Was when would you advise using code over flows? And I think that does bring up a good point as well. It's kind of like, which is something that might get hinted at in the panel later on when we talk about with the keynote. But you can use Apex. Apex can be involved from flow, and that's a really good principle. So, and that's one thing that I often hear. Kind of developer / like on the people who are developers with good admin skills kind of often talk about going, well, if you build something in Flow, use invocable Apex to fill in the gaps that Flow can't deliver on, and they often recommend that as a good practice. So I think that was still on topic, and I think that's is a good point as well around invocable Apex.
Yeah, and the next one here then. For people leaning more into flows, what is the minimum amount of Apex skills a low-code developer should still have? And what is the best way to pick up those Apex or other more traditional developer skills? That is a great question. So I think that some of the conversation that's been going on in like the social media world, things like that, has been a little bit on edge about new PA admins learning Flow and misusing the tool. So I think that some Apex, so you don't need to go down the Apex route to understand Flow, but Apex is built on what we call object-oriented programming language. So object-oriented programming is a structure that goes across multiple different coding languages, Apex included, and understanding some of those principles is really important. So I'd say that might be a starting place. And then there's even boot camps online. There's coding boot camps that just gives you that introduction to object-oriented programming. And it's understanding things like, how do I use variables? How do I use loops? And all of those best practices to make sure that we're creating flows that are sustainable. So it might be fine doing 200 different record triggered flows at the beginning because you have a small number of users, you don't have a whole ton of records coming through, you're not going to be hitting any limits. But if you start to have all of those flows happening off of the back of the same record update, and you start to have a whole ton of records coming in, you start to grow, you start to keep building things, then that's where you can see governor limits being hit, but also you can see records getting lower to load. So that's one of the big complaints with organizations. We hear that Lightning is slow, but actually it's oftentimes because of all of the automation that we put off the back of it. So even not only the object-oriented programming, but also understanding asynchronous versus synchronous, because synchronous is everything that's happening off the back of that record-triggered flow being that record triggered entry source. But sometimes you can ask yourself the question, does this need to happen right away, or can it be handled asynchronously? Because then it's not going to have that knock-on effect on my users. It's not going to affect the record loading in Salesforce, slow things down, especially for a sales team that's there wanting to sell, or call a support center team, thinking about our users and how they're using it as well. So there's asynchronous paths in record triggered flows that you can use, and then there's scheduled flows. So those are still developing. I'd say that there's still some more limitations around the scheduled flow, but definitely good ways to go. And then you can even use asynchronous Apex. So coming back to that coding question, scheduled flows are great for regular basis schedules, but if it needs to be happening multiple times a day, or we need to be getting a little bit more granular about what that schedule is, then we can still use the cron method on the asynchronous Apex there. Yeah, Mark, did you have anything else you wanted to add in on the back of that, or would you like to take on the next question?
The only thing I would really add on that, because again, as I say, I'm the non-coder of the two of us here, really. I guess I would say, just from a very basic kind of like non-coders perspective, an absolute minimum would probably be enough to be able to read the code, understand what is going on, and ask for help from somebody else who knows more than you do. I think that would be an absolute minimum. But that's just me. Other than that, I don't think I would be the one to answer that question.
That's fine. That's what we're both here for. So, oh, by the way, Sylvia's done a great shout out to mentorship. Yeah. So Sylvia's talked about mentorship quite a bit in the community. So check out some of her sessions around how to find a mentor, Trailblazer mentorship, all of that as well. I'm trying to keep an eye on both chats here, so I do apologize for anybody who we're missing. Next question, I'm going to shoot this one over to you first, Mark. From Pavel, what's your take on creating multiple flows per object? How much would you go towards large number of microflows versus a smaller number of compound flows?
Yeah, so I guess it's probably where I start with a side confession. I've never been on the kind of one flow per object trend, even when I got back first got into flows a couple of years ago. I understand the kind of the reason behind the debate, but I've never really been on that trend personally. So I've always kind of done the route of creating multiple flows per object. But what I've done, because one thing that can be an issue is having flows fire off all at the same time. What I've done is I've ended up using things like either decision elements historically, or even more recently, as a lot of improvement came into entry condition requirements, using entry conditions to actually prevent which flows run at the same time. Because the thing you don't really want is, say, multiple flows running all at once. Ideally, you'd want one flow to run, then another, if you're having a big chain of flows. Flow Trick Explorer is a very helpful tool as well to use with that. But even then, I would still include thinking around rep entry criteria as a really good addition to that repertoire in terms of managing when flows fire first. One thing I am working with a bit at the moment, particularly in regards to Slack, is actually using kind of trying to almost limit the number of flows that we create, which will sound different, almost if I'm kind of contradicting myself there. But what I'm meaning by that is, for example, I have a screen flow that I use for posting, for allowing users to write up messages that will go straight into Slack. I've got that as just one screen flow. And what I use with that instead is I use other flows to kind of trigger that screen floor as a subfloor. So I use that. So rather than creating like a version of that screen floor for every single object that will potentially be linked to a record that you could send a Slack message from, I've got one screen floor to handle the message, and then I'll have another floor to launch that screen floor. I think a good principle is thinking intelligently about that kind of thing. Like, can we do this with one screen floor and have this attached as a subfloor to other floors? I'm also kind of fairly big on what I refer to as a governing floor at the moment, which is kind of like a floor per business process rather than one floor per project. If you've got, say, you might have 5 business processes, which are tied to opportunities, but we're experimenting a bit more at the moment with having one floor per business process and then using subfloors in that to handle kind of some of the more bespoke elements of that, which can help with that. I'm really big on subfloors at the moment because they are so helpful in terms of just managing smaller updates. Hopefully that will answer some of that question.
Yeah, and I can add on there as well. So where that came from is from the Apex side, is from the coding side, because before the Trigger Explorer, where you could start to order those flows, there was no way of saying what should happen first in the business logic. So the only way to do that was having a trigger and an Apex trigger, and then ordering all of your classes. And that was the best practice, was to be using those helper classes anyway within an Apex trigger. So that's where that came from, was that limitation. But I think that it's still important to try to contain everything. And I liked the point you made, Mark, about the campaign, the keeping everything together around one business process. That's usually the approach I try to keep, because it is trying to make sure that we're not going to be hitting governor limits in the future. You want to think like 5 years down the road, what is this going to look like? Is it still going to be working, or am I building too much technical debt in by having too many different things happening at the same time? So limiting to some degree how many flows you have happening off the back of each object. Also thinking about different systems that might be integrating in as well, because especially around the opportunity object, it's a slightly dangerous one to start to put record triggered flows on, because if you have an integration that's creating an opportunity, that's making an update, that's calling back out, that's writing into that opportunity multiple times. I know I just did a FinDoc implementation that writes in multiple times to the same opportunity. Then that one is a really good candidate to put everything happening off of the back of that opportunity into asynchronous mode. Because unless it needs to actually happen right away in real time, then it could be slowing down or even breaking the integration as well. So just those kinds of considerations in there. The subflows, I would say, are one of my favorites to use because I'm lazy. I'm a lazy automation specialist, a lazy marketer, whatever I'm doing at the time. But I don't like to recreate the wheel. I don't like to recopy my work. I don't like to have to do things over again. And subflows are really good for that. So anything that you think, oh, this might be something I need to use somewhere else. If it's even as simple as looking up a record ID, a record type ID, or something like that, you can put it into a subflow, and that way you can just reuse it across multiple different flows. So I think that that's also a different strategy and a different mindset to take on around the subflows, is just that reusability aspect to it.
Definitely, yeah. And as I say, that's something I've been doing for probably about a year now, doing that kind of approach using subflow. So another example is I've got a flow in an org, which basically tallies how many times a flow has run, and that's controlled basically off a subflow. I use one flow to basically set off the subflow and pass in the API name of the flow that has run, and then I do a tally of how long it's taken for that previous flow to run, and all this kind of stuff. But I use basically a 2-flow method for that, where I have a flow that is the trigger, and then it passes everything I need into a subflow for that. So that's a really good point. And one bit that Vicki mentioned, which I think is a really good point to kind of invert a little bit as well when talking about kind of what integrations are coming into your org. You've also got the side, particularly as I'm conscious of more of the Slack side at the moment, is what are you pushing out of Salesforce into other tools such as Slack. Because if you've got, say, 10 flows running that's sending the same message to the same channel, it's going to start spamming and that kind of thing. So that's another other side of that thinking as well. Kind of what are you sending out of Salesforce to other sources as well, and that can also be as simple as email alerts, and things like that as well.
Awesome. So we do have some follow-up questions coming in. So I'm going to actually field those first because we're on the topic of conversation, but don't worry, Matt, we're going to get to your question too. So yes, there was one just trying to translate into Apex. Absolutely. Yeah. So I'd say that you don't need to know Apex to be able to write flows, but it helps if you're thinking of going further. So I like to say that it's a slippery slope into coding because I was not a coder to begin with, and it was a very slippery slope. So I started with actually David Liu's classes. I don't think we've mentioned those yet, but the Apex Academy on Pluralsight, I had gone through and done all of those while I was on maternity leave. I got back into my job role at the time, and one of my colleagues said, "Oh, is it possible to auto-convert a lead?" I said, well, not through anything that we can do on point and click, but I just saw this on the Apex Academy course. I bet we could do it that way. And she said, oh, great, go ahead and do it. So it was a little bit of hit and miss. And like Mark said before, the experience. So side of it, so sometimes it is that slippery slope of just saying, oh, I'd like to be able to do this, and then hitting up Apex and learning on the fly that way as well. So that was a bit of my story getting into Apex, by the way. Afterwards, I didn't do enough in it. And a course like Rad Women Code definitely helped just to make sure you're getting all of the best practices, make sure you're getting all of the basics. Yeah, so hopefully we answered that one sufficiently. For the next one, we have, so for all get records, et cetera, you get them as subflows and just business logic in the main flow. Yes and no. So I'd say that anything that we're saying here, by the way, it's very opinion-based. So you are going to hear different opinions, different strategies. There's always multiple ways to do things in Salesforce and multiple considerations, like one choice over another. So it always comes back to kind of that strategy conversation. But I would say that a good rule of thumb is if you can put one get record into a subflow, why not? That way you don't have to define that over and over again if you know you're going to be using it multiple times. Otherwise, that might be a lot of heavy lifting just for one action. So when you start to get one action, and if you think, again, the 5 years down the road, am I going to be using this again? That helps to make the decision around whether you just put it into the main flow or whether you stick it into a subflow. So hopefully, almost like, I'd say the BA kind of questions that you ask yourself, is this going to be something that I'm reusing? Is it something that I'm only ever going to need this time, or is it going to come into other places too?
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I think the answer to that would be, it depends on your context. Really, I think that is the long and the short answer for that. Generally speaking, I include get elements in the same flow, but again, it depends really on what the use case is for that. You might have a situation where you have a very specific get records that you would be only doing for one in one particular manner, and you might have that as a subflow. My only concern with having the line of thinking of doing a get records as a subflow is you will massively increase the number of flows that you create, potentially unnecessarily if you create a subflow for every single get record variation that you ever use. So again, I think the big point with that is really think through kind of what the requirements are of your flows and decide from there really what the best approach is. Because in some cases it might be having a subflow to handle some of that work. In many cases, it's going to be just include the get element in there inside the same flow in that particular example.
Yeah, and the benefit of a subflow in the first place is going to be not only reusing it, but only needing to update and maintain one flow rather than maintaining that whole set of activities or actions, maybe a decision, or maybe Git, maybe update actions. It can really be anything in a subflow. But having to maintain that across multiple different flows, it's that question of maintenance too. So if you think that you're going to be reusing it multiple times, rather than needing to document, okay, I've used that same couple of steps in X, Y, and Z flows, and I have 5 different places to update. If you make a subflow and you reuse it across different places, you only have to update from one.
True. The con on that side, if there is a con, is you might potentially, let's just say, for example, on this particular side, we're talking about like the get records, you have a get contacts. Actually, no, probably a better example would possibly be a get opportunities one, because you'd have things around you want to maybe get opportunities filtered by stage, filtered by industry type, filtered by amount, those kind of things in there. If you have that as a subflow and you change it and you have that same subflow in, say, 10 other flows, what happens if you have different requirements for each of those 10 flows? In that case,
well, I would say in
you
that
better have
case, it's
get
not the
records in
same
in a single
subflow.
one. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
It's,
But that's why I think if you're having that kind of scenario, it's like and it's really by again thinking about the flow itself. So in that scenario, I would be going, okay, if you have that particular kind of scenario, we have a subflow for get opportunities, we have it in 10 different flows, and you need variance each one. Actually, better not to have it as a subflow, but have it as a get records in each of those flows. And those
or
are the
you
kind
have
of,
to pass the conditions down into the subflow, because then you
yes,
can have different conditions, different variables being passed down into that subflow to manage all of that for you.
exactly.
Yeah. So let's come back to Matt's question here. I think Mark has done sessions on this at various events, but what is your go-to naming conventions that everyone should use for flows? Oh, that is a loaded question there. There are so many different naming conventions out there.
Yeah, yes. I feel like the appropriate response from my side is ask me in 6 months. Because
Yeah.
the thing is, yeah, I think it can change, or like my name convention regularly changes ever so slightly. What I am currently working on, though, is a repository for naming conventions. That's something I'm working on. I've got a lot of things in the work personally around flow, as you can probably imagine with how much I do around it. One of them is kind of like a big kind of like list of naming conventions. But the thing with that is, I think the main rule of thumb is find the one that works for you and makes sense.
Mhm.
And the thing I would say with that as well is, just from a consultant perspective, it can get very challenging if you're working in an organization such as a consultancy and everybody has a different naming convention. Ideally, in an org, you want to be having a consistent naming convention in there. Although you do get some funny instances where you can hop into a flow, someone might come to you and goes, "Have you done any updates on this flow?" And you've been working with somebody else. You then go in, have a look at it, and go, "Nope, I haven't worked on this because that's not my naming convention." So that's something you might encounter with that as well. But in terms of one that everybody should use, I think that really depends. That depends on the individual you're talking to.
Yeah, I'd say that just some things you want to think through when you're creating your own. Like Mark said, make it company wide so that everybody uses the same one is definitely a good starting point. But also think through how it's going to show up in a list. So when you have all of those different flow variables over to the side of your flow, do you want to have a prefix at the beginning of each one that says that this is a variable, this is a record variable, this is a text variable, this is a number variable, so that in that whole list of variables, it groups them together. That's one that I've seen people using. Make it very clear what's happening or what they're being used for. So don't just call everything account or something like that, but making sure that you're being very clear about like what it's being used for, even on your different steps, on your different actions that you're having done in the flow as well. And then I have seen some where you tie it back into the documentation as well. So always think about how your documentation is going to work after, because hopefully everybody is documenting as they go. And yeah, that can influence your naming conventions as well. So it's a good conversation to have as a team and just make sure that everybody's on the same foot there. Cool. And we have another one here, which I'm happy to start with. This one. Would you advise companies using unofficials in Flow that even though it's not supported, officially supported by Salesforce, it might break with no support in future releases? And would you recommend how you could calm any concerns and barriers? So I will just say that as a certified instructor with Salesforce, we're advised not to recommend to clients anything unofficial, anything hack, because the risk that you do run with workarounds, with kind of the hacks or unofficial, is that future releases can break it and that there is none of that maintenance in there. So it's unofficial, like it says in the name. That being said, I'll let Mark answer the rest of this just so that I don't get in trouble in particular there. But yes, I'd say that's just always a consideration. And there's going to be some industries where you're just not going to be allowed to use that, like banking industry, insurance industry, like the really strict security guidelines. You're not going to be able to use unofficial flows no matter how much buy-in you try to get.
Yeah. I'll admit I really do like a lot of the unofficial SF flows, but if I was to be asked this question, I would probably say go with Salesforce first. My opinion is with Flow as being do what you can out of the box first and foremost, and use Flow that way. And again, I have a similar thinking with the kind of you might have seen when I mentioned about the invocal apexes. My thinking is try and go with Flow out of the box primarily first, and then fill in the gaps where needed with code, which obviously might need some developer input on that front if you don't have a coding background. But I think on the unofficial SF side, it really does depend mainly, I think, on the organization is out if you do want to go down that route. As Vicki said, some organization will be like, nope, don't want anything that's from a source like that. Even though the unofficial SF crew are really, really good and they do try and maintain their stuff, they are all volunteers. So as you can imagine, sometimes life does get in the way. And there's also things such as they've got older versions of some of their things that they've created over the years. They've got some older versions which you can still use, but then they've got newer versions. So you've got all of this side of things of checking which one's current and doing updates around that. I personally don't necessarily have an issue with unofficial SF, but I would always make sure you've really vetted anything that you install from unofficial sources before you do that. So whether that might even be putting into a dev org first. In fact, I don't usually put unofficial SF resource into sandboxes first. I go to a dev org that I've set up for testing flows, and I do it that way before I even dare put it into a sandbox and go down that way. So yeah, again, most will be an answer of it depends.
Yeah, there's some organizations that won't even let you use data loader because it's a third party and it's a third party connecting into their work. So always check in with your legal team. Make sure that you get sign off first before just putting it in. Like Mark said, even into a sandbox, it can give access to things that you shouldn't, just for legal reasons as well.
Yeah, Pavel does mention something quite good, helpful as well. In the chat there was if it's Salesforce Labs on the App Exchange, that can be a good first place to start with that stuff because it is officially through Salesforce. Although the Labs program runs sort of similar to unofficial SF in some ways, and where it's stuff that people have come on as side piece of work in a lot of cases where it's not necessarily their main project. So things in unofficial things in Salesforce Labs might not get updated for a while, and those kind of things. But with it being an official Salesforce solution, it's more likely to kind of have maintenance than some of these unofficial resources that are out there.
Yeah, and anything that goes up on the app exchange needs to go through security too. So that's another thing that might get more buy-in, going back to that question about buy-in from the organization itself. It might be that a Salesforce Labs will get accepted, but an unofficial SF won't. So
Yeah, absolutely.
always worth a try.
And you never know, over the next couple of years, this might be a very, very like kind of forward-looking statement. But if you look at the most recent release, Salesforce have produced their own version of data table, which is the most popular unofficial SF resource. So you never know, over the coming years, we might see more of that kind of thing happen, where something that is really popular with unofficial SF, Salesforce might build their own official version of it and put it into a future update. Rich text is for my wish list for that.
Yeah. That was just the data tables, wasn't it, that came into Flow? That was previously only on unofficial SF, and now it's on the Flow release. So a good example there. Awesome. I don't see any other questions coming into the chat. Does anybody have any follow-ups, or I'll just give it a second here. Otherwise, we're coming up towards the end of time. But Mark, I'd say maybe a good question, just to, if there are no others, if there are, we'll hop back into the questions here. But what's been your favorite, if you don't share anything secret here, but what's been your favorite flow that you've created, like a really cool use case that you've solved or something?
Yeah. It might be a bit of recency bias, but I really quite liked the orchestration that I built for Dreamforce for my session there. So in that, what I did was I basically managed the whole life cycle of a Slack channel through Orchestrator, and built out various templates of flows. That was a really just fun flow to demo and build. I think, though, if I'm going to pick on a second one, this one will slightly contradict it, because I really also like the flow that I built, which is a fairly simple flow, but I built one for a session that I did over in Amsterdam, which was around basically how you can use ScreenFlow to essentially do the same as an orchestration. So I've picked an orchestration, I've picked a flow that basically says, okay, you don't necessarily need an orchestration for this. And what that was a ScreenFlow using subflows where you prohibited particular users from accessing the ScreenFlow if they weren't the right user, so to replicate the assignees that you have in an orchestrator. And I think that was a really fun flow to build. It was also one of those ones where I was a little bit nervous, because I'm like, is this too controversial, considering the orchestrator is like one of the hot new things in Flow, and I'm showing people how to get around it and so forth. So probably for a bit of both, I really enjoyed that session. And thanks, Pavel, yes, because that session in Dreamforce was really, 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 really interesting. And I was slightly panicked at that one as well, because my demo worked for every single attempt before the session, except my main dry run beforehand. Every other time it worked. But yes.
Live demos are always a fun experience.
Yes.
Yeah, and Mark, can we put you on the spot here? And Pavel's question or comment: the Dreamforce demo was great. I wish it was recorded. Want to make a recording and we'll stick it on the Automation Dreaming channel?
Maybe we could do that. So yeah, because I mean, a lot of the sessions at Dreamforce weren't recorded, unfortunately, which is a bit of a shame. And one of them was mine, so that's one we might come back to and do again.
For mine back in 2019, it was recorded and released afterwards, so it does exist out there now, but it wasn't they didn't upload it for the longest time, so I didn't think it was going to be, and I re-recorded it myself, so yeah, why not?
Yeah,
and
we could do that.
Yeah, nothing like putting my co-host on the spot on a live session. And yeah, with the last couple of minutes as well. Oh, one more question in here. Is Orchestrator extending as you see it because the pricing? Yeah, I don't know
Oh,
that we're able to comment on pricing too awfully much, but
yeah, yeah.
that
Uh,
he's handle all of that and keep it under tight wraps.
it is, yeah. I mean, from my understanding, the pricing is not changing at the moment, but we don't know. Um,
Who knows?
my if I was to give my personal hope, I would hope at some point that the pricing might go, but again, I don't know whether that's the case. I have my own opinions on that, which is mostly more of an off-air conversation.
Yeah, another loaded question. So we'll leave it at that. But I'll share with everybody my favorite flow that I've created recently as well. So I had one that is a crazy complicated flow. It started out as a nice, simple use case. And okay, we've got some volunteer management that needs to go on. We have different requirements around each of the volunteer roles that are happening. And each one of them has different requirements. So some need a certain number of references, some need a DBS check. They have a whole bunch of things going on. Started as a nice, simple one, but the department was growing as we were implementing the project. So as happens with a lot of different projects, we ended up taking a bit of a back pedal on it and really developing the flow, the automation as the department developed, as new people got hired on as well. And it grew into a bit of a monster. So what we did was I put the requirements into custom metadata and called that as a get action during the flow so that it could check against each one of those different roles coming in, because there's 30 different roles. So that's a lot to manage within a flow, within a decision, and not necessarily a technical team. So making any updates is harder to do inside of the flow than on a record. But a record, you can't deploy it from production. You're always relying on that data matching up. So custom metadata records, which Michelle Hansen is actually talking about this later today, allow you to have basically all of those records and a template of all of the requirements in my case, and deploy those. And it deploys all of the records with the custom metadata object that you're creating. So a really cool use case for it. And just bringing some of those requirements outside of the flow so that administration, maintenance is easier for the team. They don't have somebody who's Salesforce admin on the team. So it's making it easier for the accidental admin to maintain all of that, even though they're not particularly flow savvy. So that was one of my favorite ones recently, I'd say. And it's another one that's scheduled. So I did not put that in as a record triggered because it could get very hairy very fast. There's a lot happening off the back of that one. So it is a scheduled flow that every morning it's checking for anybody who meets their requirements, and at 9:30 a.m. processing everybody who comes through at once. So a couple of different strategies in there.
Cool. Well, we've got a
Any
couple minutes.
other questions, comments for us? We do have a little bit of wiggle room time here. So the next session on Slack is actually not starting until after. So if there are any questions, feel free to stick them in. Otherwise, we are basically up at time. Cool. Yeah, and I would say just a little call for anybody who is a Salesforce partner. If you are interested in Flow, especially it aligns with the platform app certification quite a bit. So I am running a Salesforce day next week on Platform App Builder. So feel free to join in there too, if you'd like a little bit extra. Awesome. And otherwise, I'm just saying thank yous. Mark, was there anything else that you wanted to necessarily share or bring up on the session?
Not necessarily. I think I've mentioned it yesterday, but I am looking at busy kind of what I do around the community for Flow. So what I'd say with that is if anybody on here has any particular kind of requests on that, just let me know, and that's stuff I can look into. How we can do next year. I've got some ideas rolling around in my head about other things that we could maybe do coming out of this event and the stuff I've been doing as well on Flow this year, because I think we could do a really good bit of work around that. And one of them is sort of vaguely hinted at by Sylvia, because I'm looking at the idea of how we can maybe set up some kind of like flow mentorship kind of program. But that would probably be the middle of next year before we do that.
Yeah, well, the middle of next year isn't too far off at this point. So
So,
it goes faster than you think.
6-7 months buffer time is enough, I think, to get something prepared.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, Mark, you're speaking at French Touch Dreaming as well. So
Yes.
I know
Yes,
my session is on coding basics for admins. So very pertinent based off of the back of this conversation. So if you're looking for a little bit of like the coding basics to help admins understand flows, we'll be talking about some of those object-oriented programming principles and things like that. And then Mark, what is your session on?
I am doing my ever so slightly controversial session on orchestrator or orchestrator versus subflows. Which way should you go? Which is basically hinted at that flow I said I really enjoyed building, where I'm going to have a much more ratified version of it than I did before in Amsterdam. Before we do wrap up, though, I've just seen a quick question coming from many. So you ask, and this is something that I'm actually really passionate about. So I'm going to try and quickly answer this before we finish off, which is when do you guess we will be seeing a flow certification? Long story short, I don't think we'll be seeing that necessarily anytime soon necessarily, but I've been massively campaigning for about 2 years now to actually see a process automation certification come out that isn't just a part of credential. And my pitch has been something along the lines of being like an automation consultant certification, similar to how we've got non-profit cloud consultant, but something specifically focused on automation. I've got no inside knowledge of when that'll be coming or if it is, but that is one I will be very, very happy to see come about, and that's one I've been pitching for a good couple of years now.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll leave it there. And I did see some questions in the chat generally. There was one asking for a link, so I hope I put the right one in. If you were asking about the session for the Salesforce days, it is one of the ones where you do need to be a Salesforce partner for it, but I put the link into the chat. And I don't know exactly where my session is on it, but it's next Thursday, I believe. And it will be a certification prep for platform app builder. So you'll see my name as delivering the session there. And then, yeah, if anybody's interested in marketing, then I've got marketing free start days next week too. So lots of free content going out. And then Andrew asked about the sessions for French Touch Dreaming. So Mark and I have enough on our plates organizing this conference, to be fair. I don't think we could have helped with organizing the French Touch Dreaming at the same time. But if it's not recorded for any reason, because that's a lot of organization, then that'll be another one where I'll record it separately, maybe just share it out on the Automation Dreaming Slack channel or something like that. And good call, Mark. So you have that flow survey on future content. So if you want anything else in the future, let us know. Cool. So I think we'll call it a wraps there. If there, one last check for the questions. If Salesforce had flow mascots, what do you wish it would be? Can we do Catbird from Lila's session yesterday?
I have to think of the mascot here, because I had a thought of a Slack one recently, but I don't know why. But my head just went to a sloth for Slack. I don't know why. I just thought us. But
That's like the opposite of what Slack does.
Maybe that's the idea. I just like the idea of a sloth, but I don't know what mascot could be.
Yeah, I just want to see Catbird there somewhere, because for anybody who wasn't on yesterday, I talked about the hybrid and where you have things that are overlapping. Maybe because flow overlaps with so many other different things. You've got like part actions in there. You've got flow coming in. Why not Catbird?
Or even just a bird. I don't think there's an actual bird one, is there at all?
I don't think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe because we do have a cat. So you've got Appy, who's a bobcat. So maybe just a bird.
Maybe a lionfish. Oh, I like that one too. Why
Nice.
not? We'll start pinging these ideas over to Dominique. The mama of Astra, so she'd be the
Well,
one
there
to
is
be
an
able to
owl. Yes,
create anything if we want it.
yeah, there is an owl. There's Hootie. That's right. Thanks,
There's
many.
Hootie, yeah. Hootie
Yeah.
is the mascot for all things Trailhead Academy. So whenever I teach a course or anything like that, if you go to real life Trailhead Academy courses, you get a little Hootie sticker.
Yeah.
Have one on my computer right now, where my
Oh,
kids keep going, Mom, you have a lot of stickers on your computer. They're like gluing stickers all over themselves. Look, you just like on your computer.
so I guess the two winners for that is going to be catbird or lionfish.
Sounds like it. The sloth will have to wait for Slack, Mark. A fish that flows.
Yeah. I just think sloths are cool. So
Yeah, why not? Cool. So we'll call it a wraps here. I think we're going into the realm of silly at this point, wrapping things up on a fun note. But do join us. Speaking of Slack, we'll see what Krishna thinks about our sloth idea. And Krishna Patel is going to be on the next session around Slack and how we can use third-party integrations into Slack, and giving us a little bit more around how we can do both as a declarative developer and even a little bit of code there too. So no matter your level, check that one out. And then we have an awesome keynote this afternoon. So do make sure to check that one out. All of the sessions in between as well, but just some shout outs to those two. The keynote is going to be hosted by Christy Fedora, and she is going to have Sylvia, Karat, and Johan on as our different levels, different team members all working together. So we've got that developer, architect, and admin systems manager BA role, kind of how everybody works together on a successful project. So I'm expecting a lot of really good conversation coming out of that one. Cool. So let's call it a wraps. Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you around.
thank you.